Hello everyone, it's Professor Mencken coming to you again. We're on Chapter 4. We left off with Chapter 3 on what we consider to be historical biological theories of crime. And I just kind of want to lay out in a sort of a linear fashion, just as a quick review of where we've come. So again, if we look pre-1800s, let's say we go back to the 1700s, 1600s, all the way back to the Roman Empire in the Western world, we find that during the Middle Ages and the medieval times, law and punishment were relatively unknown concepts, all right? So that there was no sort of official legal system, no criminal justice system. In fact, in many places, they didn't even have, there were no prisons. They were just local jails. Most punishment handed out during that time frame was harsh physical, punitive punishment, like chopping off an arm or burning someone, or some sort of horrible torture, as we saw in the video, the 25 most terrible forms of torture. That video I had you guys watch. There are many others that they did to people. You have to also understand that at the time, torture and executions were like they were entertainment. They were kind of like going to a Saturday football game is today. Crowds would show up, and they'd have carnivals and festivals and food and lots to drink and dancing, and then they would get around to torturing and at some point killing many of the criminals. It was like a day at the fair, very macabre. So up until about the 1800s, we really didn't have a strong understanding of our only understanding of crime was really something to be deterred through harsher and harsher punishments. Well, then comes the French Revolution. It comes a different way of thinking, and so we get some movement toward what a criminal justice system and a system of laws would look like today. But when it comes to crime, we had this interruption in this pursuit towards a more rational legal system, and that was the publication of Darwin's work on the origin of the species. With that publication came a new way of thinking about science and also about human behavior, and you had many people take up the mantle of human behavior in terms of understanding human behavior as adapting to its environment and as a process of evolution, adaptation, and and also folks, a winnowing out of the weakest of the species. And so the theories of crime became very biological. They're the field of eugenics, this sort of quasi-scientific approach to understanding human behavior and a lot of other things, but we'll just focus on human behavior. As you saw in the film I had you guys watch, it was just an odd movement, and we thought most human behavior could be explained by eugenics, and more importantly, most antisocial behavior was the product of bad genes. And the way to stop antisocial behavior or prevent it was just to get rid of the bad genes. And so you had to identify the people who were carriers of the bad gene and eliminate their ability to reproduce in the United States. That is to say, we sterilized them. And in Nazi Germany, you just euthanized them. You just put them down. And so in the end, what would happen is a species of humans that would evolve and adapt and be some sort of super species. Only the fittest had survived. Well, even at the time of Buck v. Vell, the famous case, biologists at that point had kind of started moving away from this eugenics program. Many of the eugenicists who had been hired by the top universities had had their work discredited because it wasn't very explanatory, it wasn't explaining things they thought, not just in human behavior, but also in the field of biology and medicine. But it didn't really stop the courts from grasping onto it, and it's still a concept that kind of lingers in the nation's conversations on the dark fringes today, is this idea of eugenics, and that there's a genetic basis or a genetic difference between people who are social and polite and those who are antisocial. But what we see in the modern era, say post 1950, is a range of modern biocriminal theories, and we're going to talk about 4 of those basic schools in this chapter today. Now, I want you to understand there's one case we will focus on that's most famous. And this chapter we'll discuss the infamous trial or what's known as the Twinkie Defense. There's actually been several movies, but one more recently called Milk made about this case. So before we move forward, I want you to pause, and I would like for you to do two things. One is to read this very brief explanation of the trial. It's only a paragraph. It gives you just the basics of what you need to know, who the characters are and what happened. And then I want you to watch about a 20-minute video, and this is the doctor who examined Dan White, the guy who was who shot and killed 2 people in San Francisco. And I want you to see his explanation as to what his defense really was. And the reason why this case is so important is because we're going to get to the sociological theories of crime, and I'm going to use this case as an example when we talk about different concepts, especially the concept of social strain and how it relates to crime. And so this is a pretty standard case to talk about, but I want you to have a good footing, a good understanding of what went on, and then I'll discuss a little bit about the case when we get down to the slide. So take a pause and read that, and then watch this film, and then we'll move on. This is a pretty short chapter. We're going to get through it pretty quickly. All right. Glad you're back. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the chromosome theory of crime. We're going to talk about how we've tried to discern a biological orientation toward antisocial behavior through studying twins who'd been adopted. We'll talk about IQ tests and how relevant they really are. Then we'll get to the biochemical, which is where we'll talk almost primarily about the Twinkie defense, and then we'll talk a little bit about neurophysiological factors. And this is sort of in what is no longer a new field, but when I started teaching, neuroscience was really not quite a field yet. It was there, but was it biology? Was it psychology? Was it psychiatry? What the heck was it? Well, now it's established itself as a field of neuroscience, and it's a good field, has a lot to contribute. And so in this last slide is just a couple of thoughts on that. All right. Let's quickly talk about the chromosome theory. So I am not a biologist, but here's what I do know about biology is that females have an XX chromosome and males have an XY chromosome. And so we do know that in our society, men tend to be more aggressive than women. Sociologists would argue it's because men are socialized to be tougher and more, physical, and just, you need to be able to defend yourself and to defend your family, etc. Some biologists would argue, well, that males have more testosterone, which makes them stronger physically and also makes them more aggressive. Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. So one theory was that what led to crime, particularly violent crime, was the presence of an extra Y chromosome. And so it was assumed that because women are more, so I'll click on my little thing here. So women had 2 X chromosomes, and women are less violent and less, and again, we already know that 90% of crimes that are arrests are for men, not women. So that women are less prone to crime, and that men have an XY chromosome, but most men are relatively well behaved, but some are pretty hardcore criminals. Well, if you look at the logic here, 2 X's, people don't get in trouble. X and a Y, a little more aggressive and macho than women are. So then you have some men who are really into, getting in trouble all the time, starting fights, that sort of thing. Well, it must be these guys have an extra Y chromosome, because obviously the maleness, the aggression and et cetera, must be coming from the Y chromosome, because women don't have one and they don't behave that way. All right, so that was a working theory in the 1950s. It has a certain logic to it. The problem is it doesn't really have any data to support it. There just aren't any strong statistical relationships between the presence of an extra chromosome and criminality. Most of the people in jail don't have an extra chromosome. Most of your violent, toughest, meanest, nastiest violent offenders just have an XY chromosome. So, all right, that theory really doesn't hold. Twin studies have been used to try to look at what is the nurture versus nature approach to crime, and to what extent is there a natural basis for criminality. So the idea was that if you look at twins that were separated at birth or separated early in life, do each matching pair show the same propensity to crime? It was a basic question. And the problem is, well, yeah, they found that if you looked at the twins over time, that the criminality between the adopted children that had been studied wasn't that different. But what could be a possible problem with that approach or with that conclusion is that they really didn't control for the environment in which the children were raised. Because think about this. You have two children, right? You have twins. Let me get my fingers into the, how do I do that? All right, here we go. Two kids, right? I'll do it like this. So I'm going to run an experiment. I'm going to take one of these kids, come on, take this kid here, and I'm going to put him with a really good family over here, up here. Then I'm going to take that other kid, I'm going to put him in with, you ever watch the show Shameless on Showtime? I love that show. I'm going to put that kid in with Frank's family down in Shameless in the south side of Chicago. Then 20 years later, I'm going to study him and say, okay, which one's more of a criminal? Well, duh, that's an easy one to answer. The one that grew up with Frank Gallagher in the Shameless household is the criminal, right? Because he grew up in that bad environment. When they put twins with foster parents, they try to put all of the children with decent families. Okay, now it doesn't always work out that way, but you can't just study the twins later on in life and say, well, they both have the same level of crime. Yeah, they do. But they were also raised in basically the same type of household, typically a middle-class household, which may explain why they both have fairly low levels of criminality, right? So we've kind of abandoned this approach to doing things, at least when it comes to trying to explain criminal behavior. Number 3, it used to be in the good old days, you had to take an IQ test, and you had to score well enough on that IQ test to get into school. Some of you, I assume all of you have probably seen Forrest Gump. I am not a fan of the movie. I actually read the original book, and the book is fantastic. The movie is just stupid. But nonetheless, I don't want to talk. I'm not about Forrest Gump. One of the scenes you might remember from the beginning of the movie of Forrest Gump is that he failed his IQ test, and they weren't going to let him into school. And then his mama did something inappropriate to get him put into school. But we won't go there. This is a Christian university. Oop, I'm going to go back here for a second. Oop, back. And it's not letting me go back. All right. So what we found is that in the early days of IQ tests is that criminals had particularly low IQ scores. And I believe that. And a number of criminologists have documented it since and today. People still look at IQ as at some measure of intelligence as a link between IQ and criminality. All right, let's just go there for a second. But is low IQ? Let's just assume low IQ is linked to crime. Okay, well, it's a stretch to buy that assumption. We'll talk about that in just a second. But let's just say it's so. Is it a biological issue or a sociological issue, or could it be a little bit of both? I believe some people are born less intelligent than others. I certainly believe some people are born with hyper levels of intelligence compared to the normal population. We've all known that kid in school from the first grade who was just flat out smarter than everybody else. I know that kid. We've all had him in our school, right? And we've also known some other kids who, let's just say weren't the brightest bulbs in the lamps. But the real problem is that IQ tests have been highly critiqued as being not necessarily a measure of innate intelligence. In other words, are you born smart or stupid? But if you are knowledgeable versus, frankly, ignorant. So, how many of you have taken an actual IQ test? Not a standardized test done by Stanford or one of these, or University of California or Iowa, one of these other schools. I've taken the simple, straight IQ test that they give everybody, standard test. I did pretty well on it. I was really proud of my score. I came home, told my wife, and she promptly told me she scored 4 points higher. But that's another story. But I did pretty well on them. I was over 130. Well, I mean, that's not Einstein, but it's like 5 standard deviations above the norm. Pretty dang good. All right. I was sitting there taking that test going, this is just basically the SAT over again. And I did a lot better on it at age 56 than I did at 18. Does it measure intelligence or does it measure knowledge? So let me give you an example. One of the questions on the test was I was given a triangle and told to find the hypotenuse. So I just tagged in Pythagorean's theorem. I said I passed geometry in high school. I barely passed geometry, but I still passed it. So I tagged in Pythagorean and we came up with the right answer. That is not innate intelligence. That is knowledge. Did I really know this stuff all that well? Were there questions on there that just tested my natural brain ability? No, most of the test was knowledge questions and ability to solve problems. There were some intellectual kind of issues on there, but for the most part, if you've gone to school and did pretty well, you were going to do pretty well on that test. Now, probably a better test, just in terms of innate ability, is the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. I've taken that test, and that's actually a pretty good test. It's not about how much you know or ability to add and subtract or divide or, solve theorems. It gives you all kind. It's about your ability to spatially reason and put things together, and it gives you different sets of gears, and you have to be able to tell which way each goes with the way you turn it. It's actually a pretty good test, and it's one that many people use as a substitute for the IQ test. Now, let's talk about criminality and intelligence. What kind of intelligence does it take to be a drug dealer, a successful drug dealer? You might say none, or you would be very wrong, because dealing drugs is just like running any other business. It basically requires, being a successful drug dealer basically requires MBA level of knowledge and skills about product market, about supply chain, about distribution, about pricing. How do you know how much to price for an ounce of cocaine? How do you know how much to price for a hit of heroin? I don't know. Is it written down somewhere? No. These guys figure it out using the same principles that CEOs of companies use to price their goods. It actually requires a high level of intelligence to be a very successful drug dealer. And what I mean by drug dealer, someone who sells drugs on the street and gets quite a bit of money doing it. Okay? So, the link between intelligence and crime might not be what we think it is. All right. Biochemical factors. Okay, biochemical factors. So some of the things you will see. Come on down there. All right. Food allergies and crime, such as caffeine, chocolate. How much stock I put in that. Diets high in sugar and carbohydrates and vitamin deficiencies, can they lead to a biochemical imbalance that could cause you to be a criminal? Well, that's the famous Twinkie Defense. Hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar, and abnormal hormone levels, particularly abnormal levels of male hormone testosterone. So this last category we also used to refer to as roid rage. People who took too many steroids would oftentimes have a very violent disposition. All right, so let's talk about Twinkie Defense. Okay, so here's what happened. On November 27th, 1978, Dan White, who was a member of the San Francisco City Council, killed Mayor Moscone and a fellow councilman supervisor, Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk is the guy they made a movie about. what happened to Dan White and why did he kill these two people? What the media has tried to claim is, and what became famous from this trial, was that he ate too much junk food, went crazy, and decided to murder these two people. Nothing could be further from the truth if you watch the video. So who was Dan White? Dan White was a very stable guy. Had been a policeman, and after he had finished he retired as a policeman, he had gone on to work as a fireman and was working as a fireman when he was approached about running for city council. Now, Dan White was a Catholic, a devout Catholic, a very conservative person running for city council in San Francisco, which is, easily one of the most liberal cities in America, especially in the 1970s. And but he won. He got on. He had his base of support in his neighborhood. He got on the council. But once he got on the council, then things started to change. So the biggest thing that happened to him, two things happened at once. One is that he and his wife were pregnant, got pregnant with a child, which is great. But at the same time, the city council told him he had to resign from his job as a fireman, which was his number one source of income, and a job he just happened to love. And he said, why? He said, well, as a city council member, you will have voting on the fire department's budget and salaries and raises and all that good stuff. So therefore, you have conflict of interest and you must step down. So he did. He stepped down, but he still had to support his family. So he opened up a small family business. I think, it was like a convenience store kind of situation, or a restaurant, maybe like a hot dog stand. I don't know, something like that. But it wasn't going well. And so he was having all kinds of problems financially. So he went on, because of this, he was experiencing a lot of stress in his life, baby coming, loss of job, loss of money. He decides to resign from the council and take his old job back as a fireman. Well, the people who spent a lot of money electing him to the city council got angry that he resigned. He was the only conservative voice on the council. And so he was facing a lot of negative feedback from them. So he changed his mind and he went down to meet with Mayor Moscone, and he wanted to withdraw his resignation. But the mayor refused to give his resignation back, and did not want him on the council. Like I said, he was not well liked on the council. He was sort of the contrarian. He always voted against all what they really wanted to do. So when he wouldn't accept the withdrawal of the resignation, he just snapped, and he shot and killed the mayor. And at the same time, Harvey Milk happened to be there, but he and Harvey Milk had never gotten along, so I guess he decided to kill him too. So his lawyers presented a mental defense because he was facing the death penalty. California had just reinstated the death penalty. In San Francisco, it had been less than a year earlier, had voted to reintroduce the death penalty into its city cases. And it turns out Dan White voted to reinstate the death penalty in San Francisco when he was on the city council. So he was facing the death penalty. So his lawyers decided what we need to do then is give you a mental defense. And we'll talk about that later on this semester when we get the chapter on defense. And the mental defense was essentially that he was mentally impaired because of all the stress in his life, and that part of the mental impairment was he developed an addiction to junk food, particularly Twinkies. And so the media took this story and said, well, this guy murdered people and then said he did it because he ate too many Twinkies and he got off. He didn't get off. He was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, sentenced to 7 years in prison. He served 5 of those 7 years. And after he got out, less than 2 months later, he killed himself. So here's the deal. What convinced him to murder these people wasn't the junk food. It wasn't the chemical imbalance that the junk food had created, and this is what the media storm, this is the reality that the media created after the trial. What led him to do that was his inability to deal with the stressors in his life and his freaking out about having a baby coming and no job and getting a lot of negative feedback from the people that helped get him elected, because he wanted to resign from the council and take his old fireman job, and he just couldn't handle it. He just freaked out, and he shot. And the last straw was this guy saying, "No, I'm not going to let you rescind your resignation letter." He just freaked out, and he shot the guy. And obviously he was never the same afterwards, because as soon as he got out of prison, he killed himself. This case is eerily similar in terms of like the media storm. You've probably heard about the coffee case as well, where the woman who spilled coffee on her lap sued McDonald's and got a $3 million settlement. The media created that story. Reality is that woman, she did spill coffee on herself. She admitted that she spilled the coffee, but the coffee was at 190 degrees. And there had been 700 other cases filed against McDonald's before that. And her injuries were third-degree burns to 6% of her body. She died 10 years later, but her injuries from the McDonald's spill had never healed. And all she had asked for was $20,000. McDonald's says, "We will give you $800. So she took him to court, and the jury said, McDonald's, you're being jerks. You're going to pay $3 million. And also, cool off your coffee a little bit." All right. Lastly on this is the neurophysiological factors. And just sort of real briefly here, is there a connection between brain dysfunction and crime? Are there certain types of brain frequencies conducive to crime? So if you do an EEG of a brain, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, does it lead to crime? These are just questions that are currently being explored. We don't really have any firm answers, and we probably won't for another 10 years or so, but there clearly is a move in this direction.